Hi everybody. Thanks for dialing in this afternoon or this morning, or it's great to see people coming in. I'm Richard Milne. I'm senior social scientist in Wellcome Connecting Science. I work as part of the Society and Ethics Research Group, and I'm really happy to give this second seminar in the series around the work that we've been doing on Your DNA, Your Say. And if you've got questions during the talk, there's the Q&A function on the webinar, so if you can drop them in there, and then Chris Patch is going to be helping moderate those at the end. So let me share my screen, and there we go. Okay, so in this second of the seminars, I'm going to build on what Anna introduced last time. So a couple of months ago now, I think Anna gave an introduction to how the Your DNA, Your Say study developed, and how we got to where we are now. And what I'm going to do is to run through some of the findings that we've published in a series of papers around public trust, and then hopefully open up a discussion about what kinds of things we might be interested in around public trust and genomic data, and where we might go in the future with some of these findings. So public trust is something that has been highlighted as something that's a question of interest and concern for people making policy around both around genomics in both healthcare and in research contexts. So this is just a couple of examples from recent strategy documents, one from the Genome UK strategy published by the UK government, which talks about the importance of trust for the trust and support of patients, the public, and the NHS workforce for the delivery of genomics in healthcare. The National Human Genomics Research Initiative in the US, similarly in their 2020 strategic vision, talks about how in order to achieve population diversity that will enable genomics to have the widest possible societal benefit, you need the trust of diverse groups of participants and their communities. So what's at stake in these discussions is public support for genomic medicine and genomics research, and the willingness of different public groups to participate. What I'm going to talk about in the next half an hour or so is around four questions. So first, I want to talk a little bit about what trust is, what we understand to be trust, and why it might be important in the context of genomics and health data. And then, building on the Your DNA, Your Say data, I want to go through three questions around who is it that's trusted with genomic and health data, who is it that's doing the trusting, and how does that differ? And then finally, some work around recent publication around what might build trust. So I want to briefly introduce what we mean by trust and why it gets complicated in relation to genomic data, particularly as we increase in scale and geographical reach. So all trust relations involve a situation in which A trusts B to do X. That's the kind of the philosophical algorithm of trust, essentially. But and it's required because we're in a situation where we're faced with a decision, or we need somebody to act in a particular way, but we're not entirely sure that they'll do it, and that we may even be harmed by them acting differently to how we expect. So I like this definition of trust from the sociologist Open Mechanic. So to trust is to say that we believe that individuals and institutions will act appropriately and perform competently, responsibly, and in a manner considerate of our interests. So we believe that the people we trust will act in our interests, either because we feel that it's in their interests to do so, either because they genuinely care, or because they want to do their job well, or because they'll be punished if they don't. Or we might believe that they'll act in our interests because we've interacted with them in the past. So the fundamental kind of example of this in the case of medicine and medical data is around the relationship between the patient and the doctor. In this case, the patient gives information to the doctor in order to enable treatment for the care. And this is a really personal type of trust that's often enabled or based in a kind of long sequence of trusting interactions. And it's shaped within a particular social and cultural framework that establishes what the roles are for both patients and doctors and what we might expect of that. So thinking about health and genetic data. So again, this interpersonal relationship might be a starting point in terms of providing genetic data to enable the delivery of care. It might also be in terms of the delivery of research. So we might be providing data not only to enable our care, but to enable care in the future. And that might involve direct relationships with researchers, either in the public sector or researchers in the private sector. And here, we might not be just relying on our own individual interaction with these people, but possibly by a more generalized type of trust and our experiences of interacting with these types of people in the past. And this type of trust, in turn, is much less emotional and personal, but it might be more abstract or cognitive. So some people characterize these as differences between thick and thin trust relationships. So thick trust relationships, those that happen within a small radius, maybe only extended to those people who are close to us, whereas thin trust maybe extends over a much larger radius, including those people who are socially distant. So data sharing becomes who we trust and who we give our data to, or data about us to, becomes increasingly complex as we interact with more and more actors, including those that we might interact with indirectly. And as these are not only individuals, but as their institutions. So for example, the Sanger Institute here in Hingston, the NHS as the health system, a population biobank, or even a commercial genetic testing company. And that these relations are not only, and these relations are increasingly global as well. So in this context, trust is a means of allowing others to act on our behalf in situations in which things are increasingly complex. So we might not only have direct relationships of data, we might have indirect data relationships. So we trust the institutions that we give data to be responsible for that data and to act in trustworthy ways in their relationships with diverse other actors. And I mean, this is obviously, I mean, I spent a long time trying to kind of map this complexity onto a slide, but it's inevitably only part of it, because each of these different people, the doctors, the NHS, the research institutes, is also engaged in all kinds of similar relationships with a really diverse range of other people. And that even the boundaries between the types of goals we're talking about between care and research are not clear and become enmeshed. So what I'm trying to do through those kind of various pictures was to show three things about trust. So the first is that it's relational, that it exists and emerges in particular social interactions, and involves relying on somebody and believing that they're going to act in a particular way. That it's socially patterned because it involves different types of relationships between individuals and other individuals, or individuals and institutions, and between institutions, and that these might have different goals and interests. And that also it's spatially patterned, so particularly as we think globally, how we trust intersects with different social, cultural and legal systems around the world that shape how we are able to trust. So just to illustrate this, before I come on to talk about genomics, this is a choropleth map, basically mapping the levels of trust around the world based on a survey called the World Values Survey, which runs, I think, 80 or more countries around the world. And it's a question about general trust. So like generally speaking, do you think that most people can be trusted, or that you need to be careful in dealing with people? And so this is the share of the proportion of people who say that they think most people can be trusted. And you can see that it varies substantially between those countries you might consider as low trust and those countries you might consider as high trust. And there's a kind of layers of complexity underneath this as well, in terms of if you're asked about generally most people can be trusted, there's a question of what do you think of as general? What's the radius of trust? How far out through our families, communities and populations do we think of as being general, and what do we think of as being specific to us? This variation as well comes out not just in general, but also in relation to science. So this is data from the Wellcome Global Monitor that's derived, so this is their trust in scientists index, which is based on a range of measures around the extent to which you expect somebody to be open, or a company or a researcher to be open and honest, and to do work that benefits the public, or that has public benefit, or to provide accurate information. And you see that there is variation between countries, so particularly in terms of the Gini coefficient, so the Gini index. So this is the more unequal a country is, essentially, the lower the trust in scientists. And it also varies in terms of individual backgrounds. So, for example, levels of education, increasing education, strongly associated with increasing trust. It's also, trust in science is also associated with confidence and trust in other kind of authority bodies, so the military, judicial system, or national governments. The more you're likely to trust those, the more you're likely to have trust in science. So this is the kind of global context that we're talking about genomics in. And the question is, what are the implications? How does trust in genomic data sharing initiatives reflect this kind of global complexity? So, as many of you I'm sure are aware, that the range of global genomics initiatives is proliferating. So this is from 2019, from a paper by researchers involved in the Global Alliance for Genomics and Health. This is one from 2020 from IQVIA, the pharmaceutical contract research organization, mapping the number of initiatives around genomics around the world, and pointing to 93 in North America, 35 in Europe, 24 in Asia, 4 in Africa, and 31 which were either international or didn't fall into those 4 groups. And that these initiatives are not only, well, on the one, some of them are public sector initiatives, some of them are private sector initiatives, a few are both, and others for which the data aren't available, but it shows that there's a range of different groups and organizations involved in collecting genomic data, and there's a lot of them around the world. So that's the context for Your DNA, Your Say, essentially, which is our global survey run in 22 countries in 15 languages with nearly 37,000 responses. With the aim of understanding kind of attitudes towards and familiarity with the collection and sharing of genomic and health data, and bringing public views to using these to inform the development of frameworks around genomic data sharing, including within the Global Alliance for Genomics and Health. And I want to point to 3 bits of data that we've analysed within this data set. The data set is now also freely shared through our website. So if you want to do further analysis on the data, then do get in touch and be interested in talking about how that might work as well. Because there's so many interesting things to explore beyond what we've already done. But I want to focus on these 3 questions of who's trusted, who trusts, and what can we do to build trust. And going back to this relationship between between doctors, between researchers in the public sector and researchers in the private sector in the first instance. So this is something that's received a fair amount of attention in the literature in the past. And what these existing studies show is a kind of hesitancy often around sharing genetic data or biobank data as well with the private sector or with commercial companies, or any suggestion of commercialization of biobanking. But they also emphasize that this hesitancy is conditional as well, that there are circumstances in which it might be better to have genetic data sharing or genetic data collection with commercial involvement than none at all. So we're interested in exploring this question across our sample, and so focusing on answers to a question around trust within the Your DNA, Your Say survey, around the extent to which you would generally trust different types of doctors, universities, companies, and governments as well in your own country and around the world. And when you look at that data from the whole sample of 37,000 people across the different groups, that might be interested in collecting or using DNA and health information, there's a clear gradient. So where somebody's own medical doctor consistently comes out as being the most trusted. So and across the sample, it's nearly 80% of people saying that they would trust their medical doctor with their DNA and health information. And then that drops off across other doctors in your country, university or non-profit researchers in your country, company or for-profit researchers in your country, who fare slightly worse than governments. And then not only does that gradient shelve off and trust decrease across those bodies within a country, but also worldwide. Once you're thinking about the trust in the use and collection and sharing of that information outside your own country, the levels of trust are significantly lower. So if you're comparing here, any doctor worldwide with any doctor in my country, the worldwide is a fraction of that in the country. We see these kind of gradients by country as well. So consistently high levels of trust in individual doctors, lower levels then of trust in any doctor in your country, and often about the same as trust in a non-profit or university researcher, and the lowest levels of trust among these groups in a company researcher. But the differences aren't the same in every country. So if you look at the differences between non-profit and for-profit researchers in countries like Egypt, India, Pakistan, and USA, in our sample, those differences are smaller. And this trust has these levels of trust have consequences for how people engage with genomics research and genomic data collection. So as we would say, in particular, the more of these groups you trust. If you trust more groups, you're more likely to be willing to donate. Essentially, is the so people who trust their doctor and at least one other person have increased odds of being willing to donate compared to those who don't. And you can see that across the countries in our sample. And also, as you might expect, trust in each actor is associated with an increased willingness to donate for use by that actor. So if you have trust in companies with your DNA and health information, you're more likely to be willing to donate your data for use by those companies. So that's who's trusted. So this gradient of doctors, public sector researchers, or non-profit researchers, and then company researchers. The second question I wanted to come to, though, is around who trusts. And this is an analysis that we published about 18 months ago now, focusing just on the samples within the Your DNA, Your Say data set from the USA, Canada, UK, and Australia. So that's just about 9,000 people. And we did a latent class analysis on that data to try and identify subgroups in terms of how people trust, based on their responses to five different trust questions. So trust in my doctor, any doctor in my country, non-profit researcher in my country, for-profit, and government. In the modeling of that, we found that kind of a three-class model worked best, and that this is what it looked like. We split the sample essentially into these three subgroups. So 41% of our sample from those countries fell into this low overall trust group. And so these were people who, if you compare them with that general pattern of trust, actually their trust in their own doctor is moderate. It's substantially lower than the average level of trust in these countries. And then they have virtually no trust in any of the other individuals or organizations that we asked about. At the other end of the scale, you have a high overall trust group. So this is a subgroup who has high levels of trust in all of the individuals and organizations that we're asking about. So almost the opposite in a sense of the low trust, with little variation across and little gradation across this kind of social gradient. And in the middle, you have 43% of the sample fell into this variable trust group, which is the one that kind of mirrors the overall pattern. So these are people who had high levels of trust in medical professionals, moderate trust in university researchers, and low trust in company researchers and their own government. And this is work, so we've just, so I have an MPhil student working with me who's just replicated this analysis, just focusing on the UK data, finding very similar patterns just in that subgroup. And again, it'd be interesting to see how this looks across some of the other countries in our sample. In terms of the membership of that subgroup, we found that the high trust group were more likely to be male, they're more likely to have children, have personal experience of genetics, and within that 4-country pooled analysis, they were more likely to be from the USA. In contrast, they were less likely to be over 50 and to have less than tertiary education. And once we'd identified these subgroups and looked at what other variables in our data set were associated with that, as you might expect, we found that willingness to donate was strongly associated with membership of the high trust group. We also found that in terms of people's concerns about re-identification as a result of on the basis of their DNA, they were less likely to be concerned about uses of data by government, police, or for marketing or insurance purposes. Interestingly, both the high and variable trust groups were more likely to be reassured by laws around donation than the low trust group. And then one of the most interesting findings in terms of in terms of the associations with the class was that we asked people about whether they'd had negative experiences of their data being accessed online previously, as a kind of way of capturing something about people's awareness and experience of the harms associated with data. And actually we found that negative experiences of data access online were most associated with the high trust group, in a way suggesting that having had those experiences, being trusting opens you up to potentially negative experiences, but the negative experiences don't necessarily then knock you out of that group. That kind of leads me on then to think about what it is that might help build trust. And so this is the third set of analyses I want to talk through. And in this one, rather than focusing on individual level questions around the willingness to donate, we treated countries as a unit of analysis, and focused on a list of questions around what would help you trust the people responsible for your DNA and health data, and then to look at which options on that list came out highest in different countries. And what we're trying to get to is a distinction in what we're talking about in terms of trust. So I introduced this picture before as this kind of A trusting B to do X. But the two figures on the slide have different positions and different roles in this trust relationship. So what we've talked about to an extent so far is around the act of trusting. And that puts a lot of emphasis on this person here, the person who's placing their trust. And some of the things we've explored in, for example, the later class analysis are the things that are associated with being trusting, the experiences, beliefs, and knowledge that are associated with being a member of the high trust group. And that these are also things that are socially and historically situated. So in the sociological literature on trust, there's a kind of contention between whether trust is a kind of rational assessment of somebody's past behavior and of their likelihood of doing what you expect them to do, and the extent to which it's just partly down to your own disposition and how that relates to how people in your country or culture traditionally trust, so your trustfulness in that sense. But the other side of this is around trustworthiness. So this has received a kind of growing amount of attention around in the discussions around health data, and works emphasize the need for kind of open communication of information, different forms of transparency, and the importance of governance, shared values. And what those do is emphasize the features of the object of trust, the person who is being the trustee, the person who's being trusted, or the institution who's being trusted, and whether they are reliable and whether they have the appropriate commitments and values to act in the ways that they might be expected to. And so you see this So just you see this in the policies such as the Genome UK one, which emphasizes the importance in building trust of things like policies, processes, systems, regulations, legal frameworks, and public engagement, and the need for legal sanctions. These are all elements of what can make an organization trustworthy. So, as I said, we asked people what would help you trust, and we got a consolidated ranking. So we looked at how the ranking of these 10 options fell out across the different countries, and then we weighted them and ranked them to produce a consolidated ranking of how they looked across all the countries. And came out as with this order, in which the most important was the transparent information about who's going to benefit from data access, the option to withdraw, then who's using information and what they're doing with it, and then things like transparent information about how others will benefit personally, and the option to opt out. As well as doing this consolidated ranking, we just looked at across the sample in terms of kind of gross numbers. What is it that came out as the things that people selected the most as the options that would increase, as the measures that would help them trust, and we got the same ranking from that as well. So again, with this, who's benefiting, option to withdraw, who's using information, how do others benefit personally. But what we found within that, so that's the overall ranking, but what we also found was substantial variation between countries. So for example, if you look at the UK relatively closely matches the overall pattern in terms of the importance of knowing who's going to benefit. In our Chinese data set, in our Chinese sample, actually the option to opt out of data use came out as the most important option. In Germany, it was the question about who is it that's using information. And in Japan, it was the importance of sanctions. So there is a kind of heterogeneity to this global picture. And actually this question about sanctions was the one that had the most heterogeneity and the most variation within our data set. So in terms of the importance of sanctions to help build trust, we had only 5% of people in India selected that option compared to 60% in Japan. And then some things like the importance of having a direct interaction with the gatekeepers were quite divisive in terms of countries that if you took the kind of average number of people, the average percentage of people who endorsed that option, you had a lot of countries both above and below it. So there's this global diversity and heterogeneity. And what we tried to look at then was about the extent to which you could correlate this across countries. So how closely did the ranking in one country correlate with the ranking in another country? And we used that to produce a dendrogram to try and understand the relations between the countries, with an aim of understanding really how likely, if you introduce measures to try and build trust, how likely are they to transfer across contexts if you're working at a global scale. And what was fascinating about this was that at the highest level of clustering, we ended up with 2 clades. So one of which included 20 countries in our sample, and then the other of which included China and Russia. So suggesting that there was something distinct going on in the ordering in Russia and China compared to the rest of the groups. At a smaller and more granular level, we also came up with some really interesting pairings. For example, kind of the close proximity of the rankings in the UK and Canada, or in Spain and Mexico. And I think that's interesting in terms of giving us possibilities in how we might approach future comparative work around what it is what are the qualities of a trustworthy genomic data initiative, and how does that vary internationally. So where I want to finish, having gone through kind of that work on trust from your DNA, you'll say, is just to flag up a few of the conclusions from this work. So first, both the theoretical and the empirical literature that demonstrates that trust varies in relation to different actors and across and within countries, and in relation to what you might call the trustfulness of the person who's doing the trusting. Those last slides, I've hoped to show some kind of what global qualities of a trustworthy genomic data system might look like. And these include the ability to answer questions related to the benefits associated with genomic data. So how does collecting and using data concord with my interests in this trust relationship. The importance of control in facilitating trust, the ability to withdraw and opt out of data use. Again, this is, and then transparency, which comes up again and again in the literature around trustworthiness. So who is it particularly that we're being asked to trust, and who is using the data? And then also, as part of that transparency, but the importance of understanding motives. So how do we know that the interests of those who are using data are aligned with our own? And then you finish, I think, inevitably with a caveat around that. So Honora O'Neill, I think, has perhaps written the most seminal works around trustworthiness, and she emphasizes that, you know, being trustworthy might help in gaining trust, but it's neither necessary nor sufficient. At best, it can provide the grounds for trust. So what it might do, though, is that if we are clear about what a trustworthy genomic data initiative looks like, and we're able to communicate that, it may reduce the likelihood of misplaced trust, of people putting trust in untrustworthy genomic people collecting data, or institutions collecting data. And that might in turn establish a kind of virtuous cycle in which trust is less likely to be betrayed, and then maybe can be placed better. There are also, I think, our latent class analysis points to the fact that there are some people who are going to be harder to reach, or who may never trust, but also the importance, I think, of not forgetting those people, that those are the people who still need to be involved, included, and able to benefit, that there isn't a quid pro quo associated with trusting. I think it's also important to emphasize that trust is not solely a matter of rational choice, but it's also down to kind of individual dispositions, and those are dependent on the historical and cultural circumstances in which we are, and that we shouldn't necessarily, again, assume the transferability of the measures to increase trust. So thank you. That's a kind of rapid whistle through quite a lot of work on trust, and I'd be really, really interested in talking about it more. In terms of these seminars, we're going to carry on talking about Your DNA, Your Say, and genomic data sharing through the autumn. So Professor Yali Kong, who's our collaborator from Peking University Health Science Center, is going to be giving a seminar in October. And Yali is one among a really great group of collaborators. So thank you to everybody. And I'll stop there and open things.
Thank you, Richard. The odd thing about these webinars at a distance is we can't then have the room of the discussion, which is what we sort of really need for these sorts of issues. If you have any questions, please type them into Q&A if you can. And we do have one question. The first figures on trust, this is from Lee Kopak, the first figures on trust date from 2014. What do you think the influence of the Trump administration and COVID might have been in there? I put the might in there, might have been in the US.
As on Trump, I don't know. I mean, I should suspect that, as with everything else, there will have been a kind of bifurcation, a parting of the ways in terms of trust in the US, and a kind of polarization. I know there's kind of regular polling in the US around trust and trust in science, and I think in terms of COVID, I think that one of the things that's been interesting is, from the data that I've seen anyway, is around the initial spike in trust, that there was a kind of potentially like an immediate, so March to June maybe last year, of kind of increase in trust, but that hasn't necessarily persisted. And I think there's a difficulty between, you know, how much is trust just about COVID and in the context of COVID, and how much is it about trusting public health bodies and scientists to enable us to move through the COVID pandemic, and how much of it is a generalized thing that, in, you know, if there is such a period as a kind of post-COVID future, how much of that shift will persist in the future.
Thank you. And people are also putting their questions into the chat, so please excuse me if I miss one. But there's a question from Ross Coron, I think. Fantastic presentation. What type of information did you collect on respondents? And he or she is particularly interested if respondents were asked if they were currently receiving treatment care for a condition. Talking to the fact that patients have a more with genetic disorders tend to have a more positive attitude towards genomic medicine than the general public.
No, it's a really, I mean, you find it, I think repeatedly, the greatest support and greater trust among those people who are either themselves affected or have family histories of genetic conditions. And we did ask, so we asked at the start of the survey, we asked people whether they were familiar with DNA genetics or genomics, and if so, how they were familiar. And so there was a kind of list of options there, one of which was that you were a person affected by a genetic condition or had a family member, or that you worked in relation to genetics, or that you had direct consumer genetic testing. And we grouped those in terms of people who said that they were unfamiliar, which is, I think, by memory, it was about 22,000 out of the 37,000. And then in terms of people who were familiar, and then people who were personally familiar, so particularly those people with family histories or who worked in the area or with genetic condition themselves. And we do find consistently across basically every analysis that we do that, you know, people who are personally familiar with genetics are more willing to donate. They are more trusting of the people involved and institutions involved in collecting and sharing genetic data. So yeah, and it is a really important kind of, we know a lot why the Your DNA Your Say data set is such a nice data set, is that we have a lot of data on things that motivate participation, questions of trust among biobank participants, or among rare disease patients, or among communities that have an interest. And I think that the ability to then extrapolate out from that into the population is challenging. I think you don't always have that direct ability to communicate that. So I think I think it's why it's a nice data set to work with.
And from working on this data set, Richard, do you have any top tips for scientists, researchers, and people running these big genome projects so they can demonstrate their trustworthiness?
I mean, I think I think there are two parts to it. I think one is, you know, three parts. Let's go with three. So one is that, so the first is that there are a range of things which might contribute to building trust, and that actually a lot of those are recognized and are being implemented in some way. And I think I think we're at the start of that. Sometimes there's a lot of conversation around transparency, and for example, and I think there's a need to kind of carry that through, and also to think about what it is that that's doing in terms of, you know, what is it that we think about trust. So, and where's that appropriate? So we want to be, if we're being transparent about our motives, it's because in that trust relationship, we want people to believe that we're going to act in their interests. And I think that's so there's, yeah, so keep doing those things. But also then the second part is recognizing that they may be very different in different places. I think that what we consider as being trustworthy in the UK from our data would suggest that might not be the same in Japan or China or even Germany. So it's so recognizing the importance of context and the fact that trust comes with a huge amount of historical baggage and a huge amount of cultural baggage in terms of how we interact with people. And then there's some classic literature around trust in governments and trust within industry and economies around, I mean, in places like Italy and Japan, and that kind of shows this complexity and diversity, that it's not just a kind of algorithmic, you can plug this in and it'll work anywhere kind of thing. And then I think the third part is the O'Neill point, that, you know, you can be, it's brilliant to be trustworthy, but it might not get you trust. it doesn't necessarily take you to where it's going. And also, I think one of the so adding a fourth point, because I put a paper in there, the definition from trust and trustworthiness that I was using comes from a paper by Mark Sheehan and colleagues in the Journal of Medical Ethics last year. And it's a really nice paper in terms of drawing a distinction between the situations in which we might want trustworthiness, and we might want a relationship of trust, and those in which we might want reliability, I think. So distinguishing between data security architectures, which we might just want to be reliable. We don't want to have to think about them. We want them to be kind of technical things that we don't, that don't come with that uncertainty and risk that you need trust for. But at the same time, there are then questions around, who should we allow to have access to data? How do we, whose data are security systems do we use and stuff, which actually are questions that come with uncertainty, where you want to have a trustworthy individual there, which is, I think, where you come in, Chris, as the Caldecott guardians, as the kind of the people who are the embodiment of trustworthiness. That those are the situations where you need trust, and there are other situations where trust might not be the thing that you're looking for.
And there's a follow-up comment from Ross. I sort of know what I think about this, but it's your seminar, so. So he says, it feels if we want to increase confidence, increasing public literacy among the general population is a good place to start.
I mean, we come back to that fairly regularly, I think, and I think there are a lot of reasons to. I don't think it is. I don't think it is wrong. I mean, so what you see in the question of brand trust is, that people are more trusting when they with those levels of education, as levels of education increase. So overall, I mean, higher education is associated with increased trust. And I think, though, there are also a huge number of reasons why increased literacy around science and genomics are valuable things in terms of enabling people to participate in conversations and to feel that they're able to participate in those conversations as well, and not to feel excluded. And I think that if you feel excluded, then you are less likely to trust. I think, though, it's not necessarily a direct relationship between, if you increase literacy, you're going to increase trust. I mean, the paradigmatic example of that is the genetically modified crops debate, where actually the people who had often the least trust in what scientists and government were doing were actually the people who knew the most on surveys. And so I think consistently that relationship between knowledge and trust, specifically knowledge and trust, I think doesn't necessarily hold up.
And then in the Q&A from Sophia Louis, thank you so much for this talk. Was there any research as to whether people would trust services that paid them for their genomic data? I think this is really interesting.
That is really interesting.
Questions to explore.
Yeah, but no, we didn't. We didn't ask anything about that, and I think it's a really I'd be fascinated by that. I mean, one of the really interesting analyses that we did. So this was a student who worked with us last year, Sarah Kelleso, who did work on Canada and the USA, Canada and the UK, public trust around genomic data in Canada and the UK using the USA data set. And what she found was that in Canada, particularly, where levels of trust in companies were low, the willingness to donate to companies was higher than you might expect.
Right.
And that part of this, I think, again, comes back to the necessity and sufficiency question around trust. That it is, I think, for public sector organization, it's incredibly important, because it's the kind of the ability to show that you're acting in the public benefit. I think where you also introduce private benefit and the ability to get some kind of service or product, trust is less important. I mean, when we did some research last year around the contact tracing apps and people's views on those, and when you ask people about, you know, would you trust Google and Apple to run a contact tracing system? And yes, you had people who were like, no, I wouldn't trust Google and Apple with my data ever, or Facebook. But actually there was also things, well, yes, I trust them to run a service because it's kind of what they do. And you've got a much clearer transactional relationship there, I think, that that you don't have once you start to get into kind of questions of care and the public sector.
And this is my question really. In terms of your DNA, your survey, how much do you think, how much comparable data can we get out of it to compare different countries, do you think? Or is it at some time the time to think about actual comparable studies? Because the data to me is biased towards North America in terms of the genomic data sharing. And clearly from the provisional analysis that we've done in your DNA, you'll say they're different, the context makes a difference.
Yeah, I think it really does. And I think, I mean, for me, I think that's one of the places that, yeah, that all of this needs to go, is to have the kind of the detail and the depth across countries that we have, particularly within the USA. But yeah, and always with that ability to compare and contrast. I mean, the example I think that is probably at the forefront of, because the analysis that we're working on at the moment around the return of results, I think is probably is the best example at the moment in terms of the work that has been done around the extent to which people want to get their genetic data back, and particularly the extent to which getting genetic data back will motivate them to participate. That kind of, yeah, that transactional quid pro quo, or whatever you call it, that involves, you know, you participate, I give you something back. That there's a lot of evidence in the USA that, quite rightly, in terms of writing policy, we say we're going to listen to what participants and the public and patients want. That there's a really important voice in how we make policy. But it's always the question of, you know, which publics and which patients, and that if that discussion is dominated by one context, one particular way of doing healthcare, one particular way of incorporating genetic medicine and genetic research into healthcare, then that's going to do an injustice to the variation and the ways that it might be better done elsewhere, and yeah, and then just tip up problems down the line. It's I do, because I wrote my PhD around GM crops, I do always come back to it, but it was kind of based around a way of farming and a particular model of agriculture. And then not only did you have to export your technology and your crops, but you also had to export that way of doing agriculture, and that was often the greater root cause of the debate, not necessarily the technology itself. No, it's the
UK Human Genetics Commission, which sadly is long gone, which I was part of, was set up as a response to the GM crops outcome in the UK, as a way of increasing public dialogue and public consultation, and also opinions in delivering policy. I'm not going through that process again. It was interesting.
And I mean, it's like there's a limit. I mean, there is a limit to how far you can take the GM crop example. I mean, I think for me, it's always I wrote my PhD on it, and it's kind of I was it was a really interesting period of time, and but yeah, it doesn't necessarily, it has its limits as a comparator as well. Yeah.
We actually don't have any more questions in the chat or the Q&A. I know Anna Middleton's on the webinar. I just wonder whether you had any sort of comments or further questions for Richard.
Oh, hello.
Yeah, hi.
I wasn't expecting to be brought directly in.
No, we've got 5 minutes, so I thought I'd give you a chance.
No, it's fine. It's lovely. It's actually lovely to see the participants on the group and the eclectic mix. And I'm also really enjoying seeing that we've got a lot of our collaborators from Your DNA USA on the call. So it's just really nice to see them. No, I don't have any specific comments, just other than to say, well done, Richard. Really great analysis, and it's great to pull together the trustworthiness literature. No, that was it really. I'm happy to finish there if you'd like to.
Okay, so back to you, Richard, to wind up.
Well, thank you, Chris. Thank you, everybody, for the questions, and yeah, and do come back to hear Yali talk in October. Hopefully, by which point my house will be cooler and I will not be on the verge of collapse in a kind of very British, like, my God, it's more than 20 degrees kind of way. But yeah, and if anybody is interested, if so, I mean, among our collaborators, it would be great to talk about if you're interested in doing more research on trust, but also more broadly as well, if people are interested in any of this, or in building on any of this, or collaborating in any way, then do get in touch. We're always very happy to hear from people. So
okay, yeah. So thank you very much, everybody, and thank you to all the questions, and we'll close the seminar now.
Thanks very much, Chris.
Again. Okay.